Chapter 5 of Greek and Roman Ghost Stories. Visions of the Dead in Sleep. In most of the Greek and Roman stories that survive, the wraiths of the dead are represented as revisiting their friends on earth in sleep. These instances I have not, as a rule, troubled to collect, for they cannot strictly be classed as ghost stories. But since the influence of the dead was generally considered to be exercised in this way, I shall give a few stories which seem particularly striking. That it was widely believed that the dead could return at night to those whom they loved is proved by the touching inscription in which a wife begs that her husband may sometimes be allowed to revisit her in sleep, and that she may soon join him. The most interesting passage that has come down to us, dealing with the whole question of the power of the dead to appear to those whom they love in dreams, is undoubtedly Quintilian's 10th declamation. The fact that the greatest teacher of rhetoric of his day actually chose it as a subject for one of his model speeches shows how important a part it must have played in the feelings of educated Romans of the time. The story is as follows. A mother was plunged in grief at the loss of her favourite son, when, on the night of the funeral, which had been long delayed at her earnest request, the boy appeared to her in a vision, and remained with her all night, kissing her and fondling her as if he were alive. He did not leave her till daybreak. All that survives of a son, says Quintilian, will remain in close communion with his mother when he dies. In her unselfishness she begs her son not to withhold the comfort which he has brought to her from his father. But the father, when he hears the story, does not at all relish the idea of a visit from his son's ghost, and is, in fact, terrified at the prospect. He says nothing to the mother, who had moved the gods of the world above no less than those of the world below by the violence of her grief and the importunity of her prayers, but at once sends for a sorcerer. As soon as he arrives, the sorcerer is taken to the family tomb, which has its place in the city of the dead that stretches along the highway from the town gate. The magic spell is wound about the grave, and the urn is finally sealed with the dread words, until, at last, the hapless boy has become, in very truth, a lifeless shade. Finally, we are told, the sorcerer threw himself upon the urn, and breathed his spells into the very bones and ashes. This at least he admitted, as he looked up. The spirit resists. Spells are not enough. We must close the grave completely, and bind the stones together with iron. His suggestions were carried out, and he at last declares that all has been accomplished successfully. Now he is really dead. He cannot appear or come out. This night will prove the truth of my words. The boy never afterwards appeared, either to his mother or anyone else. The mother is beside herself with grief. Her son's spirit, which had successfully baffled the gods of the lower world in its desire to visit her, is now, thanks to these foreign spells, dashing itself against the top of the grave, unable to understand the weight that has been placed upon it to keep it from escaping. Not only do the spells shut the boy in, he might possibly have broken through these, but the iron bands and solid fastenings have once again brought him face to face with death. This very realistic, if rather material, picture of a human soul mewed up for ever in the grave gives us a clear idea of the popular belief in Rome about the future life, and enables us to realise the full meaning of the inscription, Sit tibi terra levis, may the earth press lightly upon thee, which is so common upon Roman tombs as to be abbreviated to STTL. The speech is supposed to be delivered in an action for cruelty brought by the wife against her husband, and in the course of it the father is spoken of as a parricide for what he has done. He defends himself by saying that he took the steps which are the cause of the action for his wife's peace of mind. To this plea it is answered that the ghost of a son could never frighten a mother, though other spirits, if unknown to her, might conceivably do so. In the course of the speech we are told that the spirit, when freed from the body, bathes itself in fire, and makes for its home among the stars, where other fates await it. Then it remembers the body in which it once dwelt, hence the dead return to visit those who were once dear to them on earth, and become oracles, and give us timely warnings, and are conscious of the victims we offer them, and welcome the honours paid them at their tombs. The declamation ends, like most Roman speeches, with an appeal. In this case to the sorcerer and the husband to remove the spells, especially to the sorcerer, who has the power to torture the gods above and the spirits of the dead, who, by the terror of his midnight cries, can move the deepest caves, can shake the very foundations of the earth. You are able to both call up the spirits that serve you, and act as their cruel and ruthless jailer. Listen for once to a mother's prayers, and let them soften your heart. Then we have the story of Thrasyllus, as told by Apuleius, which is thoroughly modern in its romantic tone. He was in love with the wife of his friend, Tlepolemus, whom he treacherously murdered while out hunting. His crime is not discovered, and he begins to press his suit for her hand to her parents almost immediately. The widow's grief is heartrending. She refuses food, and altogether neglects herself, hoping the gods will hear her prayer, and allow her to rejoin her husband. At last, however, she is persuaded by her parents, at Thrasyllus' insistence, to give ordinary care to her own health. But she passes her days before the likeness of the deceased, which she has had made in the image of that of the god Liber, paying it divine honours, and finding her one comfort in thus fomenting her own sufferings. When she hears of Thrasyllus' suit, she rejects it with scorn and horror, and then at night her dead husband appears to her, and describes exactly what happened, and begs her to avenge him. She requires no urging, and almost immediately decides on the course that her vengeance shall take. She has Thrasyllus informed that she cannot come to any definite decision till her year of mourning is over. Meanwhile, however, she consents to receive his visits at night, and promises to arrange for her old nurse to let him in. Overjoyed at his success, Thrasyllus comes at the hour appointed, and is duly admitted by the old nurse. The house is in complete darkness, but he is given a cup of wine and left to himself. The wine has been drugged, however, and he sinks into a deep slumber. Then Tlepolemus' widow comes and triumphs over her enemy, who has fallen so easily into her hands. She will not kill him as he killed her husband. "Neither the peace of death nor the joy of life shall be yours," she exclaims. "You shall wander like a restless shade between Orcus and the light of day. The blood of your eyes I shall offer up at the tomb of my beloved Tlepolemus, and with them I shall propitiate his blessed spirit." At these words she takes a pin from her hair and blinds him. Then she rushes through the streets with a sword in her hand to frighten anyone who might try to stop her, to her husband's tomb, where, after telling all her story, she slays herself. Thither Thrasyllus followed her, declaring that he dedicated himself to the manes of his own free will. He carefully shut the tomb upon himself, and starved himself to death. This is by far the best of the stories in which we find a vision of the dead in sleep playing an important part, but there is also the well-known tale of the Byzantine maiden Cleonice. She was of high birth, but had the misfortune to attract the attention of the Spartan Pausanias, who was in command of the united Greek fleet at the Hellespont after the Battle of Plataea. Like many Spartans, when first brought into contact with real luxury after his frugal upbringing at home, he completely lost his mental balance, and grew intoxicated with the splendour of his position, endeavouring to imitate the Persians in their manners, and even aspiring, it is said, to become tyrant of the whole of Greece. Cleonice was brutally torn from her parents and brought to his room at night. He was asleep at the time, and being wakened by the noise, he imagined that someone had broken into his room with the object of murdering him, and snatched up a sword and killed her. After this her ghost appeared to him every night, bidding him to go to the fate which pride and lust prepare. He is said to have visited a temple at Heraclea, where he had her spirit called up and implored her pardon. She duly appeared and told him that he would soon be delivered from all his troubles after his return to Sparta, an ambiguous way of prophesying his death, which occurred soon afterwards. She was certainly avenged in the manner of it. Before leaving these stories of visions of the dead, we must not omit to mention the charming poem of Virgil's younger days, the Culex, the Gnat. Just as the first sketch of Macaulay's famous character of William III is said to be contained in a Cambridge prize essay on the subject, so the Culex contains the first draft of some of the greatest passages in Virgil's later works, the beautiful description of the charms of country life in the Georgics, for instance, and the account of Tartarus in the 6th book of the Aeneid. The story is slight, as was usually the case in these little epics, where the purple patches are more important than the plot. A shepherd falls asleep in the shade of a cool fountain, just as he would do in southern Italy today, for his rest after the midday meal. Suddenly a snake, the horrors of which are described with a vividness that is truly Virgilian, appears upon the scene and prepares to strike the shepherd. A passing gnat, the hero of the poem, sees the danger and wakes the shepherd by stinging him in the eye. He springs up angrily, brushes it off with his hand, and dashes it lifeless to the ground. Then to his horror he sees the snake, and promptly kills it with a branch of the tree. While he lies asleep that night, the ghost of the gnat appears to him in a dream, and bitterly reproaches him for the cruel death with which it has been rewarded for its heroic services. Charon has now claimed it for his own. It goes on to give a vivid description of the horrors of Tartarus, and contrasts its hard lot with that of the shepherd. When he wakes, the shepherd is filled with remorse for his conduct, and is also, perhaps, afraid of being continually haunted by the ghost of his tiny benefactor. He therefore sets to work to raise a mound in honour of the gnat, facing it with marble. Round it he plants all kinds of flowers, especially violets and roses, the flowers usually offered to the dead, and cuts on a marble slab the following inscription: "Little gnat, the shepherd dedicates to thee thy meed of a tomb, in return for the life thou gavest him." There is also an interesting story of Pindar, told by Pausanias. In his old age the great poet dreamt that Persephone appeared to him, and told him that she alone of all the goddesses had not been celebrated in song by him, but that he should pay the debt when he came to her. Shortly after this he died. There was, however, a relation of his, a woman then far advanced in years, who had practised the singing of most of his hymns. To her Pindar appeared in a dream, and sang the hymn to Proserpine, which she wrote down from memory when she awoke. I have included one or two stories of apparitions in dreams among those in the next section, as they seem to be more in place there. Chapter 6. Apparitions of the Dead. We have one or two ghost stories connected with early Greek mythology. Silas, the charioteer of Pelops, though Troezenius gives his name as Spherus, died on the way to Pisa, and appeared to Pelops by night, begging that he might be duly buried. Pelops took pity on him, and burnt his body with all ceremony, raised a large mound in his honour, and built a chapel to the Celean Apollo near it. He also named a town after him. Strabo even says there was a mound in Celeus's honour at Crissa in the Troad. This dutiful attention did not go unrewarded. Silas appeared to Pelops again, and thanked him for all he had done. And to Silas also he is said to have owed the information by which he was able to overthrow Onymus in the famous chariot race which won him the hand of Hippodamia. Pelops' shameless gratitude to Omus's charioteer, Myrtilus, who had removed the pin of his master's chariot, and thus caused his defeat and death in order to help Pelops, on the promise of half of the kingdom, is hardly in accordance with his treatment of Silas, though it is thoroughly Greek. However, on the theory that a man who betrays one master will probably betray another, especially if he is rewarded for his treachery with as much as half a kingdom, Pelops was right in considering that Myrtilus was best out of the way, and he can hardly have foreseen the curse that was to fall upon his family in consequence. With this story we may compare the well-known tale of the poet Simonides, who found an unknown corpse on the shore and honoured it with burial. Soon afterwards he happened to be on the point of starting a voyage, when the man whom he had buried appeared to him in a dream, and warned him on no account to go by the ship he had chosen, as it would undoubtedly be wrecked. Impressed by the vision, the poet remained behind, and the ship went down soon afterwards with all on board. Simonides expressed his gratitude in a poem describing the event, and in several epigrams. Libanius even goes so far as to place the scene of the event at Tarentum, where he was preparing to take ship for Sicily. The tale is probably mythical. It belongs to a group of stories of the Grateful Dead, which have been subject of an interesting book recently published by the Folklore Society. Mr. Gerald doubts whether it really belongs to the cycle, as it is nearly 2 centuries earlier, even in Cicero's version, than any other yet discovered. But it certainly inspired Chaucer in his Nun's Priest's Tale, and it may have influenced other later versions. The Jewish version is closer to the Simonides story than any of the others, and I will quote it in Mr. Gerald's words. The son of a rich merchant of Jerusalem sets off after his father's death to see the world. At Stamboul he finds hanging in chains the body of a Jew, which the Sultan has commanded to be left there till his co-religionists shall have repaid the sum the man is suspected of having stolen from his royal master. The hero pays this sum, and has the corpse buried. Later, during a storm at sea, he is saved by a stone, on which he is brought to land, whence he is carried by an eagle back to Jerusalem. There a white-clad man appears to him, explaining that he is the ghost of the dead, and that he has already appeared as stone and eagle. The spirit further promises the hero a reward for his good deed in the present and in the future life. This is one of the simplest forms in which the story appears. It is generally found compounded with some other similar tale, but the main facts are that the man buries a corpse, found on the seashore, from philanthropic motives. Later he is met by the ghost of the dead man, who in many cases promises him help on the condition of receiving, in return, half of whatever he gets. The hero obtains a wife or some other reward, and when called upon is ready to fulfil his bargain as to sharing his possessions, not excepting the wife. Some of the characteristics of the tale are to be found in the story of Pelops and Silas, related above, which Mr. Gerald does not mention. Pausanias has a story of one of Ulysses' crew. Ulysses' ship was driven about by the winds from one city to another in Sicily and Italy, and in the course of these wanderings it touched at Tecmessa. Here one of the sailors got drunk and ravished a maiden, and was stoned to death in consequence by the indignant people of the town. Ulysses did not trouble about what had occurred, and sailed away. Soon, however, the ghost of the murdered man became a source of serious annoyance to the people of the place, killing the inhabitants of the town, regardless of age and sex. Finally matters came to such a pass that the town was abandoned. But the Pythian priestess bade the people return to Tecmessa, and appease the hero by building him a temple and precinct of his own, and giving him every year the fairest maiden of the town to wife. They took this advice, and there was no more trouble from the ghost. It chanced, however, that Euthymus came to Tecmessa just when the people were paying the dead sailor his annual honours. Learning how matters stood, he asked to be allowed to go into the temple and see the maiden. At their meeting he was first touched with pity, and then immediately fell desperately in love with her. The girl swore to be his if he would save her. Euthymus put on his armour and awaited the attack of the monster. He had the best of the fight, and the ghost, driven from its home, plunged into the sea. The wedding was, of course, celebrated with great splendour, and nothing more was heard of the spirit of the drunken sailor. The story is obviously to be classed with that of Ariadne. The God-fearing alien seeks to show that Providence watches over a good man and brings his murderers to justice by a story taken from Chrysippus. A traveller put up at an inn in Megara, wearing a belt full of gold. The innkeeper discovered that he had the money about him, and murdered him at night, having arranged to carry his body outside the gates in a dung cart. but meanwhile the murdered man appeared to a citizen of the town, and told him what had happened. The man was impressed by the vision. Investigations were made, and the murderer was caught exactly where the ghost had indicated, and was duly punished. This is one of the very few stories in which the apparition is seen at, or near, the moment of death, as is the case in the vast majority of the well-authenticated cases collected during recent years. Aristeas of Proconnesus, a man of high birth, died quite suddenly in a fulling establishment in his native town. The owner locked the building and went to inform his relatives, when a man from Cyzicus, hearing the news, denied it, saying that Aristeas had met him on the way thither, and talked to him, and when the relatives came, prepared to remove the body, they found no Aristeas either alive or dead. Altogether he seems to have been a remarkable person. He disappeared for 7 years, and then appeared in Proconnesus, and wrote an epic poem, called the Arum Spear, which was well known in Herodotus's day. 240 years later he was seen again, this time at Metapontum, and bade the citizens build a shrine to Apollo, and near it erect a statue to himself, as Apollo would come to them alone of the Italian Greeks, and he would be seen following in the form of a raven. The townsmen were troubled at the apparition, and consulted the Delphic oracle, which confirmed all Aristeas had said, and Apollo received his temple, and Aristeas his statue in the marketplace. Apollonius tells virtually the same story, except that in his version Aristeas was seen giving a lesson in literature by a number of persons in Sicily at the very hour he died in Proconnesus. He says that Aristeas appeared at intervals for a number of years after his death. The elder Pliny also speaks of Aristeas, saying that at Proconnesus his soul was seen to leave his body in the form of a raven, though he regards the tale as, in all probability, a fabrication. The doctor in Lucian's Philopseudus, chapter 26, declares that he knew a man who rose from the dead 20 days after he was buried, and that he attended him after his resurrection. But when asked to give how it was that the body did not decompose or the man die of hunger, he has no answer to give. Dio Cassius describes how when Nero wished to cut a canal through the Isthmus of Corinth, blood spurted up in front of those who first touched the earth, groans and cries were heard, and a number of ghosts appeared. Not till Nero took a pickaxe and began to work himself to encourage the men was any real progress made. Pliny quotes an interesting account from Herotimus of Clazomenae of a man whose soul was in the habit of leaving his body and wandering abroad, as was proved by the fact that he would often describe events which had happened at a distance and could only be known to an actual eyewitness. His body, meanwhile, lay like that of a man in a trance or half dead. One day, however, some enemies of his took the body, while in this state, and burnt it, thus, to use Pliny's phrase, leaving the soul no sheath to which it could return. No one can help being struck by the bald and meagre character of these stories as a whole. They possess few of the qualities we expect to find in a good modern ghost story. None of them can equal in pathetic beauty many of those found in Meyer's Human Personality. Take, for example, the story of the lady who was waked in the night by the sound of moaning and sobbing, as of someone in great distress of mind. Finding nothing in her room, she went and looked out of the landing window, and there, on the grass, was a very beautiful young girl, in a kneeling posture before a soldier, in a general's uniform, clasping her hands together, and entreating for pardon, but, alas, he only waved her away from him. The story proved to be true. The youngest daughter of the old and distinguished family to which the house had belonged had had an illegitimate child. Her parents and relations refused to have anything more to do with her, and she died broken-hearted. The lady who relates the story saw the features so clearly on this occasion that she afterwards recognised the soldier's portrait some 6 months later, when calling at a friend's house, and exclaimed, "Why, look, there is the General," as soon as she noticed it. Then comes the following story. The early part is missing, but Irwin Roade, in an interesting article, has cleared up all the essential details. Proclus's treatise on Plato's Republic are complete only in the Vatican manuscripts. Of these May only published fragments, but an English theologian, Alexander Morus, took notes from the manuscript when it was in Florence, and quoted from it in a commentary on the Epistle to the Hebrews. One of these treatises is called Greek title excised. The ending in Phlegon proves that the story was given in the form of a letter, and we learn that the scene was laid in Amphipolis on the Strymon, and that the account was sent by Hipparchus in a letter to Aridaeus, half-brother of Alexander the Great, the events occurring during the reign of Philip II of Macedon. Proclus says that his information is derived from letters, some written by Hipparchus, others by Aridaeus. Philonion was the daughter of Demostratus and Charito. She had been married to Craterus, Alexander's famous general, but had died 6 months after her marriage. As we learn that she was desperately in love with Machates, a foreign friend from Pella, who had come to see Demostratus, the misery of her position may possibly have caused her death, but her love conquered death itself, and she returned to life again 6 months after she had died, and lived with Machates, visiting him for several nights. One day an old nurse went to the guest chamber, and as the lamp was burning, she saw a woman sitting by Machates. Scarcely able to contain herself at this extraordinary occurrence, she ran to the girl's mother, calling "Charito, Demostratus," and bade them get up and go with her to their daughter, for by the grace of the gods she had appeared alive, and was with the stranger in the guest chamber. On hearing this extraordinary story, Charito was at first overcome by it, and by the nurse's excitement, but she soon recovered herself and burst into tears at the mention of her daughter, telling the old woman she was out of her senses, and ordering her out of the room. The nurse was indignant at this treatment, and boldly declared that she was not out of her senses, but that Charito was unwilling to see her daughter because she was afraid. At last Charito consented to go to the door of the guest chamber, but as it was now quite 2 hours since she had heard the news, she arrived too late, and found them both asleep. The mother bent over the woman's figure, and thought she recognized her daughter's features and clothes. Not feeling sure, as it was dark, she decided to keep quiet for the present, meaning to get up early and catch the woman. If she failed, she would ask Machates for an explanation, as he would never tell a lie in a case so important. So she left the room without saying anything. But early on the following morning, either because the gods so willed it, or because she was moved by some divine impulse, the woman went away without being observed. When she came to him, Charito was angry with the young man in consequence, and clung to his knees, and conjured him to speak the truth and hide nothing from her. At first he was greatly distressed, and could hardly be brought to admit that the girl's name was Philonion. Then he described her first coming and the violence of her passion, and told how she had said that she was there without her parents' knowledge. The better to establish the truth of his story, he opened a coffer and took out the things she had left behind her, a ring of gold which she had given him, and a belt which she had left on the previous night. When Charito beheld all these convincing proofs, she uttered a piercing cry, and rent her clothes and her cloak, and tore her coif from her head, and began to mourn for her daughter afresh in the midst of her friends. Machates was deeply distressed on seeing what had happened, and how they were all mourning, as if for her second funeral. He begged them to be comforted, and promised them that they should see her if she appeared. Charito yielded, but bade him be careful how he fulfilled his promise. When night fell and the hour drew near at which Philonion usually appeared, they were on watch for her. She came, as was her custom, and sat down upon the bed. Machates made no pretence, for he was genuinely anxious to sift the matter to the bottom, and secretly sent some slaves to call her parents. He himself could hardly believe that the woman who came to him so regularly at the same hour was really dead, and when she ate and drank with him, he began to suspect what had been suggested to him, namely, that some grave robbers had violated the tomb, and sold the clothes and gold ornaments to her father. Demostratus and Charito hastened to come at once, and when they saw her, they were at first speechless with amazement. Then, with cries of joy, they threw themselves upon their daughter. But Philonion remained cold. "Father and mother," she said, "cruel indeed have ye been, in that ye grudged me my living with the stranger for 3 days in my father's house, for it brought harm to no one. But ye shall pay for your meddling with sorrow. I must return to the place appointed for me, though I came not hither without the will of heaven." With these words she fell down dead, and her body lay stretched upon the bed. Her parents threw themselves upon her, and the house was filled with confusion and sorrow. for the blow was heavy indeed, but the event was strange, and soon came to be known throughout the town, and finally reached my ears. During the night I kept back the crowds that gathered round the house, taking care that there should be no disturbance as the news spread. At early dawn the theatre was full. After a long discussion it was decided that we should go and open the tomb to see whether the body was still on the bier, or whether we should find the place empty, for the woman had hardly been dead 6 months. When we opened the vault where all her family was buried, the bodies were seen lying on the other biers, but on the one where Philinnion had been placed, we found only the iron ring which had belonged to her lover, and the gilt drinking cup Machates had given her on the first day. In utter amazement we went straight to Demostratus's house to see whether the body was still there. We beheld it lying on the ground, and then went in a large crowd to the place of assembly, for the whole event was of great importance and absolutely past belief. Great was the confusion, and no one could tell what to do, when Hylas, who is not only considered the best diviner among us, but is also a great authority on the interpretation of the flight of birds, and is generally well versed in his art, got up and said that the woman must be buried outside the boundaries of the city, for it was unlawful that she should be laid to rest within them, and that Hermes Chthonius and the Eumenides should be propitiated, and that all pollution would thus be removed. He ordered the temples to be reconsecrated, and the usual rites to be performed in the honour of the gods below. As for the king, in this affair he privately told me to sacrifice to Hermes, and to Zeus Xenius, and to Ares, and to perform these duties with the utmost care. We have done as he suggested. The stranger Machates, who was visited by the ghost, has committed suicide in despair. Now if you think it right I should give the king an account of all this, let me know, and I shall send some of those who gave me the various details. This story is particularly interesting as the source of Goethe's Braut von Corinth. In Goethe's poem the girl is a Christian while her lover is a pagan. Their parents are friends, and they have been betrothed in their youth. He comes to stay with her parents, knowing nothing of her death when she appears to him. As in the Greek story, her body is material, though cold and bloodless, and he thinks her still alive. He takes her in his arms and kisses her back to life and love, breathing his own passion into her. Then the mother surprises them, and the daughter upbraids her for her cruelty, but begs that she and her lover may be buried together, as he must pay for the life he has given her with his own. Chapter 7. Warning Apparitions. As we should expect, there are a number of instances of warning apparitions in antiquity, and it is interesting to note that the majority of these are gigantic women endowed with the gift of prophecy. Thus the younger Pliny tells us how Quintus Curtius Rufus, who was on the staff of the governor of Africa, was walking one day in a colonnade after sunset, when a gigantic woman appeared before him. She announced that she was Africa, and was able to predict the future, and told him that he would go to Rome, hold office there, return to the province with the highest authority, and there die. Her prophecy was fulfilled to the letter, and as he had landed in Africa for the last time, the same figure is reported to have met him. So again, at the time of the conspiracy of Callippus, Dion was meditating one evening before the porch of his house, when he turned round and saw a gigantic female figure in the form of a fury at the end of the corridor, sweeping the floor with a broom. The vision terrified him, and soon afterwards his only son committed suicide, and he himself was murdered by the conspirators. A similar dramatic story is related of Drusus during his German campaigns. While engaged in operations against the Alemanni, he was preparing to cross the Elbe, when a gigantic woman barred the way, exclaiming, "Insatiate Drusus, whither wilt thou go? Thou art not fated to see all things. Depart hence, for the end of thy life and of thy deeds is at hand." Drusus was much troubled by this warning, and instantly obeyed the words of the apparition, but he died before reaching the Rhine. We meet with the same phenomenon again in Dio Cassius, among the prodigies preceding the death of Macrinus, when a dreadful gigantic woman, seen of several, declared that all that had happened was as nothing compared with what they were soon to endure, a prophecy which was amply fulfilled by the reign of Heliogabalus. But the most gigantic of all these gigantic women was, as we should only expect from his marvellous power of seeing ghosts, the one who appeared to Eucrates in the Philopseudus. Eucrates has seen over 1,000 ghosts in his time, and is now quite used to them, though at first he found them rather upsetting. But he had been given a ring and a charm by an Arab, which enabled him to deal with anything supernatural that came in his way. The ring was made from the iron of a cross on which a criminal had been executed, and doubtless had the same value in Eucrates' eyes as a piece of the rope with which a man has been hung possesses in the eyes of a gambler today. On this particular occasion he had left his men at work in the vineyard, and was resting quietly at midday, when his dog began to bark. At first he thought it was only a favourite boy of his indulging in a little hunting with some friends, but on looking up he saw in front of him a woman at least 300 feet high, with a sword 30 feet long. Her lower extremities were like those of a dragon, and snakes were coiling round her neck and shoulders. Eucrates was not in the least alarmed, but turned the seal of his ring, when a vast chasm opened in the earth, into which she disappeared. This seems rather to have astonished Eucrates, but he plucked up courage, caught hold of a tree that stood near the edge, and looked over, when he saw all the lower world spread before him, including the mead of asphodel, where the shades of the blessed were reclining at ease with their friends and relations, arranged according to clans and tribes. Among these he recognized his own father, dressed in the clothes in which he was buried, and it must have been comforting to a son to have such good evidence that his parent was safely installed in the Elysian fields. In a few moments the chasm closed. Dio Cassius relates how Trajan was saved in the great earthquake that destroyed nearly the whole of Antioch by a phantom, which appeared to him suddenly, and warned him to leave his house by the window. A similar story is told of the poet Simonides, who was warned by a spectre that his house was going to fall, and thus enabled to make his escape in time. I will include here a couple of stories which, if they cannot exactly be classed as stories of warning apparitions, are interesting in themselves, and may at least be considered as ghost stories. Pliny the Younger tells us how a slave of his, named Marcus, imagined that he saw someone cutting his hair during the night. When he awoke, the vision proved to have been a true one, for his hair lay all around him. Soon afterwards, the same thing happened again. His brother who slept with him saw nothing, but Marcus declared that 2 people came in by the windows, dressed in white, and, after cutting his hair, disappeared. Nothing astonishing happened, adds Pliny, except that I was not prosecuted, as I undoubtedly should have been, had Domitian lived, for this happened during his principate. Perhaps the cutting of my slave's hair was a sign of my approaching doom, for accused people cut their hair, as a sign of mourning. One may be allowed to wonder whether, after all, a fondness for practical joking is not even older than the age of the younger Pliny. This story, like nearly every other that we have come across, has a parallel in the Philopseudus. Indeed, Lucian seems to have covered almost the whole field of the marvellous, as understood at that time, in his determination to turn it into ridicule in that amusing dialogue. In this case we are told of a little statue of Aesculapius which stood in the house of the narrator of the story, and at the feet of which a number of pence had been placed as offerings, while other coins, some of them silver, were fastened to the thighs with wax. There were also silver plates which had been vowed or offered by those who had been cured of fever by the god. The offerings and tablets are just such as might be found in a Catholic church in the south of Europe today, but the coins in our more practical modern world would have found their way into the coffers of the church. One would like to know what was the ultimate destination of these particular coins, whether they were to be sent as contributions to one of the temples of Aesculapius, which were the centre of the medical world at this period, and had elaborate hospitals attached to them, about which we learn so much from Aristides. In this case they were merely a source of temptation to an unfortunate Libyan groom, who stole them one night, intending to make his escape. But he had not studied the habits of the statue, which, we are told, habitually got down from its pedestal every night, and in this case such was the power of the god that he kept the man wandering about all night, unable to leave the court, where he was found with the money in the morning, and soundly flogged. The god, however, considered that he had been let off much too easily, and he was mysteriously flogged every night, as the weals upon him showed, till he ultimately died of the punishment. Ælian has a charming story of Philemon, the comic poet. He was still apparently in the full vigour of his powers when he had a vision of 9 maidens, leaving his house in Piraeus, and bidding him farewell. When he awoke, he told his slave the story, and set to work to finish a play, with which he was then busy. After completing it to his satisfaction, he wrapped himself in his cloak, and lay down upon his bed. His slave came in, and, thinking he was asleep, went to wake him, when he found that he was dead. Ælian challenges the unbelieving Epicureans to deny that the 9 maidens were the 9 Muses, leaving a house which was soon to be polluted by death. Many stories naturally gather round the great struggle for the final mastery of the Roman world, which ended in the overthrow of the Republic. Shakespeare has made us familiar with the fate of the poet Cinna, who was actually mistaken for one of the conspirators against Caesar and murdered by the crowd. He dreamt on the night before he met his death that Caesar invited him to supper, and when he refused the invitation, took him by the hand and forced him down into a deep, dark abyss, which he entered with the utmost horror. But there is a story connected with the crossing of the Rubicon by Caesar that certainly deserves to be better known than it is. It is only fitting that an event fraught with such momentous consequences should have a supernatural setting of some kind, and Suetonius relates that while Caesar was still hesitating whether he should declare himself an enemy of his country by crossing the little river that bounded his province at the head of an army, a man of heroic size and beauty suddenly appeared, playing upon a reed pipe. Some of the troops, several trumpeters among them, ran up to listen, when the man seized a trumpet, blew a loud blast upon it, and began to cross the Rubicon. Caesar at once decided to advance, and the men followed him with redoubled enthusiasm after what they had just seen. It is to Plutarch that we owe the famous story of the apparition that visited Brutus in his tent the night before the battle of Philippi, and again during the battle. Shakespeare represents it to be Caesar's ghost, but has otherwise strictly followed Plutarch. It would be absurd to give the scene in any other words than Shakespeare's. Brutus. How ill this taper burns! Ha! Who comes here? I think it is the weakness of mine eyes that shapes this monstrous apparition. It comes upon me. Art thou anything? Art thou some god, some angel, or some devil? Ghost. Thy evil spirit, Brutus. Brutus. Why comest thou? Ghost. To tell thee thou shalt see me at Philippi. Brutus. Well, then I shall see thee again. Ghost. Ay, at Philippi. Brutus. Why, I will see thee at Philippi then. Now I have taken heart, thou vanishest. Ill spirit, I would hold more talk with thee. But it had already disappeared, only to meet Brutus again on the fatal day that followed. End of chapter 7. Recording by Timothy Ferguson, Gold Coast, Australia.